Tell me about your most recent success on the government side.
Well, that has to be a $1 million grant that came through about a month or so ago. It was done for an institute that has a research component to it, a nursing home. It's in the field of aging, a nursing home, all kinds of healthcare components, specialized Alzheimer's programs, et cetera, et cetera. And the trend in healthcare now is to reduce institutional care, to reduce the numbers of hospitalizations in and out of the hospital, in and out of the emergency room, which has really been driving up the cost of healthcare considerably. So I was asked to write a federal grant application. It was for a mobile doctor's office that had a social services component to it as well, that would go out and to the homes of, and it was aimed at three very underserved populations, isolated populations in Queens, largely immigrants, three different immigrant populations, and it was to visit people who were elderly and infirm, who couldn't, for whatever reason, go out of their homes, weren't going out of their homes to see doctors, and would end up in an ambulance, going to the emergency room instead of getting regular care, and who also didn't have access to the kinds of socialization and support services that they could be getting. So it's an organization that I really have a lot of respect for, and I love them, and I was happy to do that.
Mm-hmm.
But
So take us back to the first moment you read the RFP or RFA, the request for proposal, and how did you begin to work on that grant? What did you do first, aside from reading the RFA?
Well, first I had a conversation with the vice president for research, who said to me that she thought that we should aim for a score of in the high 80s. And I said, no, I don't think so.
What do you mean by score?
Well, federal grants are scored. Each section is assigned a number. It might be worth 5 points. It might be worth 15 points. It might be worth 30 points, and they add up to 100. So when people are reading your application, usually outside readers are assigned. They're very competitive, and they read your application, and each person gives you a score, and then they take the totality of it and average what different people have given you, and those with the highest scores get the grants.
Mm-hmm. So this person wanted to get a score in the high 80s.
In the high 80s, and I said, that wouldn't be what I would say. I would say that we need to go 95 or above to be competitive. So she said, okay, let's go for that.
Mm-hmm.
So it really involved, I went through the application. I looked at, I had written before for this organization, so I knew something about them, but they're a very, very large, complex organization. So, and I had never written in this particular program before. So I went through and I identified, I probably spent a day and a half writing down questions that I had, trying to figure out what did I already know and what did I need to find out, what did I need to understand. So they gave me an outline of what this program was going to be, and I read the outline, and it was very helpful. But then I said, well, where's your outreach component? How are you going to reach these hardest to reach communities if you're not writing in an outreach person, somebody to lead that, and who are they going to be? So that was like a light bulb, and that kind of changed the nature of the proposal itself. And so once I identified what my questions were, I I was able to say, can you send me something? Send me this. Send me some background information on this. Have you ever done a demographic study in these neighborhoods before? They hadn't done it, so I knew that I had to go online and and look at what the demographics were, what the income was, how many people over the age of 75 there were in these neighborhoods, um, so what the healthcare outcomes were in those neighborhoods, and so what kinds of, how many hospitals were there, what was the whole picture. So that was pretty time consuming, and in my experience, you almost always have to do the research yourself. A big component of any grant, but particularly a federal grant, is the needs section. You have to demonstrate that there's a need in the communities for what you're proposing to do, and that what that means is that there's a gap in services.
Mm-hmm.
So that's very, very big, and that's something that most organizations don't have.
So when you decide you need demographics, where do you go to find them?
I go online.
Mm-hmm.
You look at the
sites?
you put in the zip codes. I put in the zip codes, for example, of the area that I'm looking at, and I'll go to the census, of course, and I'll read the census reports. I'll look at, if you say, okay, this neighborhood is Elmhurst, let's say, in Queens, New York, Elmhurst. What's Elmhurst?
Mm-hmm.
Where is it? How many people live in Elmhurst? So, and in a federal grant, it is you have to have footnotes. Everything has to be footnoted. Every fact that you state has to have a footnote.
So, in this instance, they told you what they wanted to write the proposal about.
Yes.
So how do you work on? So usually they tell you something and it's not very defined.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you work on really developing what the plan is for that proposal?
Well, even in this case where there were, they had a plan, and we worked on it together. But at a certain point, working off when I was posing my questions to the director of the vice president for research, then she was identifying things that she didn't know the answers to. So ultimately, she pulled together a committee of people. One of them was the person who would lead this project if it was funded. So she pulled together a committee of different people who had knowledge in particular areas. The director of nursing, the one of the doctors who might be involved in this, someone from social services, and so in some cases, we would have a conference call and she would have them, respond to my questions, and then I would write something and I'd say, I don't know if this is right, and she would send it around to the proper people.
So you ended up with a team of people who are working together.
Yeah, I did all the writing, but no one person can know. But you can't make this stuff up.
So you already mentioned the needs section, and then of course there's a proposal narrative section. Then there's a number of other sections. What else is generally asked for in a government proposal?
Well, they want to know who your organization is. It's not so different than any other proposal that you would write, except that they'll ask the same questions over and over again in great detail. And so they almost always start with questions about the background of your organization, and there might be, what's the history of your organization? Then they'll have another question, which is, it might say, well, why was your organization founded? And then it might be, what's the mission of your organization? So one of the things that people find very frustrating about federal grants is they feel like the same question is being asked over and over and over again, and it is.
Mm-hmm.
They'll ask you, what are your objectives in this? And what objectives do you have? And then they'll say, what outcomes will you be looking for? What will your goals be? What kinds of activities are you going to do? Will these activities? Who will conduct the activities? And every single thing is a different question. Every component of it, and I love that.
And why do you love that?
I love it because I know what I have to do and what I have to find out, and it's challenging because you have to have a lot of information, and one of the things that I learned that was very helpful to me was right away I knew that I wanted to get people to tell me stories so that I could put examples in. So I always going to staff people and asking them, to illustrate for me with an example from real life what this is all about.
So you already talked about getting a high score. How do you make sure you get a high score in each section of your proposal?
Well, you can't cherry pick. You can't say, oh, this one's only worth 5 points because, so I'm not going to pay that much attention to it.
Mm-hmm.
You have to write the perfect answer for every question that there is, no matter how many points it is. You have to assume that you are going for all the points, whether it's worth 30 points or whether it's worth 5 points, that you're going to put the same effort into it and give it the same amount of. A 5-point question might be, 10 pages, and a 30-point question might be 25 pages, and so you just can't cherry pick. You have to really go for it. And I think one of the biggest challenges about federal grants is that you must take them seriously. When they say this is what they're asking for, you can't give them something else. And I'll tell you a really good example. I was writing a proposal for a mental health organization, very well-respected mental health organization that wanted to open a health clinic. So this was a request for health funding. And one of the questions there was, they listed a bunch of different models for the way you could do this. So I said to the executive director, are you familiar with these? Yes. And I said, well, which one do you think? I need you to tell me which one we're going to go for. And he said, none. And I said, well, what do you mean none? No, we have a better model in mind. And I said, you're not going to be funded. And he said, well, I think our model's better. This is what I want you to do. So I did what he asked. There was no way to do anything but what he asked. So when the results came back, every section got a perfect score, and they got a 0 on that section for not answering the question.
Yeah.
So these folks are serious. You can fudge. You can give it a different slant when you're writing a foundation proposal or a corporate grant application, but not with the feds.
I had a faculty member once I was working with on a proposal, and she was over the page limit. Oh. So she decided, and this was for NSF, she decided what she'd do is send it in 10-point font.
Oh, yeah.
And their requirement is 11.5 Arial or 12 points for Times New Roman. Right. So she sends it in 10-point. They took this is when you actually sent them in, where it wasn't electronic then. She sent it in. They took the proposal, they put it in an envelope, they mailed it right back to her.
Mm-hmm. I'm not surprised. Yeah. So, they're not gonna waste 3 people's time reading that when. Yeah. I think doing federal grants is very good training for anyone.
How so?
Because of what you're saying, it's very rigorous. Mm-hmm. A lot of people won't touch a federal grant. Most grant writers want to keep away from them. But and that's the reason, because it's a lot of work and it's very, very rigorous. But the reason I say it's good training is that if you can follow their rules and you can come up with the kind of detail that they're looking for, that they're looking for enough detail to be persuaded that this program is real. Mm-hmm. That they're not throwing away $1 million or $650,000 or whatever it is, and so you really have to be able to push the people that you're working with to think through
Mm-hmm.
what this is all about.
Mm-hmm. What happens? Give us an example of a grant that didn't get funded that you thought was really good, and what did you do after it didn't get funded?
Well, I think that's the only federal grant I ever wrote that didn't get funded, the one I told you about. But I could tell you some things. I'll tell you another story, though, I'll tell you a story that happened to me twice with foundation grants.
Mm-hmm.
So twice this happened where I wrote a proposal for a competitive grant that were given by one of them was this just happened the WT Grant Foundation, which gives a program improvement grant to 2 or 3 organizations every year. So last year I wrote one for one of my clients, and the program was like slightly underdeveloped. They had just started it. It wasn't fully conceptualized, and they give comments. We didn't get the grant, but I read the comments and I said, "Wow, I think we were very close here." So this year I recommended to the client that we reapply because there was more detail. We had more. They had done the pilot project and had more information that really addressed all the gaps that were identified from the year before. So this year they got funded.
Uh-huh.
And in another instance too, an organization was giving a grant for innovative programs, and I wrote with the president of the board of this organization what was this fabulous proposal, really fabulous. It had to do with early childhood education, and it was rejected, and the president of the board was irate. She could not believe there could have been anything better. So the next year, they put out this thing again, and we were going to apply with something else, and they were having an information session about it. And the person who was leading it used the proposal that we had written the year before that was rejected as an example of a perfect application. So I was completely flabbergasted. And I called them and said, what's up? And the woman said to me, "Oh, it was by far the best proposal we received. But there were 2 people on the committee who were offended that you didn't include the library, the local public library as a partner." She said, "Why don't you just resubmit it and include the library?" So we did, and it was funded. Mm-hmm. So that's what you can do sometimes. I mean, sometimes it's worth finding out why.
Yeah. Tell us what if somebody's writing their first government grant? What are the top 5 things that they need to do to make sure they get funded?
Leave enough time for yourself. A Bureau of Primary Health Care grant, they say it takes 120 hours to produce one. So you have to leave enough time. Can't do it at the last minute. That would be number 1. Number 2 is don't be afraid to show people your early drafts. Let a lot of people see your early drafts, because you can get input that's very, very good. So that would be something else. Follow all the rules, as we were saying. Don't think you can get away with anything, because you can't. I do a lot of rewriting. I do a lot of rewriting anyway, but particularly I think with a federal grant, that application that's so complex, the way that I handle the complexity is I might write the answer to a question one day, and then the next day I might read that over and say, that's the answer to this other question over here. Mm-hmm. I think you can never think that you've got it. You have to keep rethinking, how is this working? Is that 4? Let's say, what would be 5?
Yeah, well, when you end, you'll end.
When I end, I end. Okay. So, and then, make friends with everybody that you possibly can. Um, I made friends with a guy on an airplane who turned out to be a consultant who got paid by the government to write these kinds of grants. And I asked him to read my grant and my application. It wasn't done, but I asked him to read it, and he did. Mm-hmm. And so I think you want to really um, not not think of it as something that is just coming from you. You have to get a lot of input, and don't be scared of it.
Is there any other things that you'd like to share with our viewing audience?
Well, I think the field for I think there's probably a lot of jobs for people who want to write federal grant applications because so many people don't want to do it. Mm-hmm. And there are a lot of consultants out there who charge a lot of money to do a federal grant, like $20,000, for example, and some of them aren't even that good. So I once wrote a grant for a guy who had used one of these consultants 3 times and had failed. His clinic had failed, and it was a wonderful clinic. It was really a crime that they had just done this, stereotypical application for him, and someone recommended that he try me and go one last time, but have me do it, and he got funded. And the reason he got funded was because I could see that the story was such a wonderful story. Mm-hmm. It was an organization that was started by Muslim students at the University of California after the Watts riots, who wanted to do something for the African American community, and they mm-hmm. founded this clinic, this health clinic, and it was such a beautiful story. And so now they're funded and flourishing.
What do you do when a CEO comes to you and wants to write a grant that doesn't really meet the criteria or is not good for the organization because it's mission creep?
I don't take those. I mean, as a consultant, I don't take those jobs. Mm-hmm. As an employee, I would argue. Mm-hmm. I mean, I would argue the case. I think that in the classes that I teach on grant writing, I always warn the students against that. And I tell them about the pressure that you get from the directors, and a lot of pressure. But I mean, what I think that you have to, in addition to being able to write and conceptualize, I think that you have to understand the field that you're in and what the competition is and what stage of development an organization is at. I work with an organization now that brings together therapy dogs with at-risk youth, and it's modeled after the prison dog program. And it's quite successful, and they're always wanting me to apply for youth development grants for them. But I know that they can't compete yet, and we have this conversation about once a month. And I know they can't compete. They are a youth development program, but they're not big enough, and they don't have enough outcomes. So we get lots and lots of money from organizations that love dogs and fund animal stuff. But I think that you yourself have to have a sense of, you have to understand what the field is.
Well, thank you, Harriet.
You're welcome.